Good afternoon and welcome to this special presentation here at the O'Hanlon Center in Mill Valley, California. And it's an honor for me to host this special event with Jeffrey Milburn, the artist. My name is Norman Renee Poulin. I'm the founder of Living Consciously by Design. And I'm a former hospice minister and a sacred space consultant. And it's an opportunity for me to bring forward my own work of supporting people who are living their dreams. And Jeffrey is here today to tell us his story and how his body of work known as the Universalist Group was created. He will also discuss his book, Omni Art, The Language of Consciousness, his 6-year-old podcast, the Omni Art Salon, where he has conducted over 260 interviews with some of the most noted intellectuals and politicians, artists, and scientists in the world. And his podcast is actually viewed in over 90 countries throughout the world. And he will also discuss his first museum installation in New York and how he founded the Omni Art movement 30 years ago. So with that in mind, I welcome you, Jeffrey, to this special event.
Thank you.
And would like to know from your own words what you would like to present in today's gathering.
Well, I think it's a big, wide subject, Omni Art. Mm-hmm. And I think the most interesting part of it for me as the artist who created this art movement is how it came to be. Mm-hmm. I don't know if most people even think about, art movements and what they are and how they come into an existence. And I'm not even sure if my story is anything similar to any other art movement. Mm-hmm. But it's very honest. It's very clear how it happened, and it's developed over a number of years. The very first Omni Art piece came into existence in 1981 when I was living in Denver, Colorado, and I was working in the financial services industry as a security analyst, and I got a studio that was in the area of Denver called NoHo, which was like Denver Soho at the time. This was on the west side of Denver in this very funky area, a lot of bohemian people living there. And I got this great studio in a building that had been occupied by hippies in the 1960s. It was a 1880s hotel, and I painted one of the rooms out completely white that was all psychedelic colors and wild. So I had this sort of explosion of energy that became the container for this next layer of awareness coming in, because in the 1960s, the United States, there was a lot of activity in certain areas of the country regarding working with consciousness that was coming from other dimensions. Mm-hmm. And the first initiation of that occurring was generally through the use of medicinal plants, mm-hmm. Psilocybin, marijuana, and then there was, of course, the acid with Timothy O'Leary. So that era had already broken loose a lot of the cultural idioms from the 1950s and the 40s and before that. And so in 1981, I got this art studio. I painted it all white, and that's kind of like the energetic that was behind it, and I was taking it to the next layer. And the two main pieces, which actually are, there's details of them right here behind us, mm-hmm. they were created in that studio in 1981. And the way these pieces came to me was completely unusual, because this piece in particular is I call it Soul. At the time I called it Map, because I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was some kind of map. Mm-hmm. And this piece here I called Truth. And as you can see, there's a hand reaching out of the head and there's a third eye open. So it was about looking into the inner worlds to ascertain what it is that the human story is really all about in a new way. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I didn't understand this piece at all. I got this piece in a dream. I just saw it like the guy in the film Close Encounters who built the Mud Mountain. Right. I was like, I have to make this thing. So I remember going to my garage and creating part of it there and then taking it to Denver into the studio. And when it was completed, I just looked at it like, I have no idea what this is. It was very compelling to get it out. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really understand what this piece meant really until 1997. So we're talking a 16-year period, a span, to understand mm-hmm. what this piece symbolized. And it was really compelling just to do it. And so mm-hmm. in the midst of what was happening in the United States, you know, Andy Warhol had created the pop art movement in the early 60s, which then kind of took over and spoke to our culture in a very particular way about art being a piece of the culture that reflects what's going on in the zeitgeist of our culture. Mm-hmm. So, you know, pop art was about the surface of our culture, about popular objects, popular idioms, getting them out into the world, and how our culture's been formed around that kind of commercial base. Mm-hmm. So I'm doing this thing, I'm managing money for Wall Street for a major bank in the daytime, then the weekends, I'm going into this other dimension, looking at this stuff, not knowing what it is. So it was a really bizarre beginning.
I can imagine.
But it was very compelling. So when I left Denver in 1984 to move to New York City, because I knew that was where this kind of originality was best understood, because mm-hmm. Denver, as great as it is as a city, is a very secondary market when it comes to origination. Mm-hmm. And they tend to consume culture rather than produce culture. Mm-hmm. But I grew up in Boulder, so that was a whole another little bastion of intellectuals and idea people. And, you know, and when I was growing up, you know, Bucky Fuller was running around town, and that was that era of the late 60s and early mm-hmm. 70s. So I took the art pieces to New York, and I started using them in performance installations in the East Village and in Soho, and at that time, Andy Warhol was really in his zenith, really, because he died in 1987. So I was mm-hmm. there only 3 years before he left. Mm-hmm. And I still had no idea what to call this art. I mm-hmm. didn't call it Omni Art until 1988. So, but I worked with these two pieces in performance installations, and that's a term that I actually coined, I believe, about 1983. Right? I did one performance installation in Denver before I left. And what that means is that I would use these three-dimensional artworks in combination with music, mm-hmm. which I wrote, created an entire sound musical landscape. And then I worked with, my very first performance installation actually was working with dancers from the Naropa Institute in Boulder, which was not a university at that point. It was kind of like a land of Allen Ginsberg and, you know, Jack Kerouac and the Buddhists, and it was all mixed together with this amazing
very
place.
Eclectic.
Yeah, very eclectic. And I had this woman who was a choreographer from the Naropa who worked with me, and we created movement, dance, working with the music. And at that time, I worked completely live. I used all live music. And I had an entire band orchestra with me. And we used the art pieces, and I just knew this was a new form that really had to be put together with all three elements of the arts. It had to have the dance and movement in it, it had to have the artworks in it, and it had to have the musical landscape in order to have its complete voice and its complete expression. So I started working with that in New York, and I was using it in different art events and small events, and it was kind of site specific, and I just kind of invented on the fly, you know. And meanwhile, I was also kind of on the fringe of the Warhol Revolution that had happened. There was a lot of those people who were my friends who were working at the factory and whatnot. So when Andy died in 1987, it was like a huge gap in the art world, because many of these expressions were occurring in clubs and in downtown scenes and lofts and all kinds of venues that were not, you know, that common to the media. How would I say this? They were not that available to the mainstream at all. There's a lot of things happening that people didn't know about.
Well, there's also some exclusivity about those arenas.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And a lot of things happen at PS1, which is a downtown gallery scene, kind of a public space. So I was in the midst of all that, meanwhile doing my development. And then in 1980, I guess it was 1987, I moved up north of New York City to an area near Rhinebeck, right on the Hudson River, and got a studio in Germantown, this little town right on the Hudson. And it was just north of Bard College, which kind of lines the river there, this kind of East Coast Oxford type campus. It's a very interesting place. But it was there that I asked the question, just, you know, I kind of posed the question, I'm looking at all these artworks that are coming, a lot of them I still didn't even understand. I still had no idea what this was.
Yeah, you said it took about 16 years.
Yeah,
for you to
it
get
was
some
like I knew there
clarity.
was something going on there. As you can see, there's a mirror in the center and there's a shape. You can't see the whole piece here, but we'll try to put that on the video so where you can see the whole piece. It's a diamond shape, and it's shaped like a volcano. I'm like, I don't know what this is, but I kept using it anyway. And so here I'm getting all this art ready, and somebody said, you know, there's a woman who's doing really, really cutting-edge shows in Long Island, who's a curator from England. Her name's Madeline Burnside. You really have to talk to her about this. So I did. I just called her up and gave her and told her what I was doing, and she says, please come see me. So I went to see her. This is at the Vanderbilt University in Islip, Long Island. I sat down, I told her what I was doing. She goes, okay, well, when do you want to show? I mean, literally, it was that
easy.
Well, it wasn't easy, but it was that fast. I mean, I showed her some pictures. I talked to her about what I was doing, and she booked a one-man show at her museum. So I took what I had at that point, which is about, I had the Universalist group, which you mentioned, is a group of 12 artworks that have come to hold the body of the entire paradigm that Omni Art represents. And I was not able to use all 12 pieces in that museum. It wasn't large enough. So I used, I think, about 2/3 of the pieces, and I did a whole video shoot of that particular time. But this show has actually still, to this day, not been seen in its totality, which is interesting.
So is that one of your goals, personal goals, and to maybe have the installation complete?
Oh yeah, I'd like to see it completed. Because in the meantime, I've also completed an entire musical landscape. And I have added the third character, which I was in development over the years too, in different performance installations, and that is to use kabuki characters that I create myself that represent aspects of each one of those musical pieces that complete the whole Universalist group installation. So, but back to Madeline Burnside, I put the show up, and I sat, just before this was in March of 1991, just before that show, I was sitting in my studio and going, what is this artwork? You know, what is this? I know it's I didn't even know how to describe it, but a lot of it was starting to come clear now. Found the 5 Platonic solids in California. They're made out of natural quartz crystals of the dodecahedron, the icosahedron, the cube, the tetrahedron. They all represent they're sacred geometrical pieces that represent these 5 dimensions that the Omni Art paradigm really revolves around. And so, again, I asked the question, what is this art? And I was just kind of contemplating on this, and I just got this nudge to walk across the room. I pulled out this book I've had for a long time called Critical Path. It was the last book written by Buckminster Fuller on his extraordinary life of creating culture and science, and a remarkable philosopher, King, who was one of the resident philosophers at Boulder, of all things. And I looked in there, and the first page it said, omni-directional humanity becomes omni-successful in omni-universe. I'm like, omni? It might be Omni Art. So I just kind of went with that for a bit. And I went, you know, that's kind of it, because it's music, it's movement and dance, it's plastic arts, it's written word, it's kind of all the arts. So that was the first aspect of the word omni. But the more intriguing aspect of the word omni is the way we use omni when we describe the divine. So you have the omnipotent God, the omnipresent God, the all-knowing, omniscient, omniscient God, or omniscient is how you say it. And I thought, wow, is this also about the divine as well? So this is all now going along. Remember, this is taking 16 years to piece all this together and trying to figure out what this is all about. Meanwhile, what's going on in America and the world in general is that there are a lot of scientists who are quantum physicists who are doing further research. There's more proving going on. There's more experimentation going on, and they're investigating how vibrational field patterns are actually coming from a source, a singular source, what we call singularity, that come out into the universe, form vibrational field patterns that then represent the physical universe. And, you know, planets are born out of fields that we don't know. You know, stars appear out of fields we do not have scientific instrumentation to analyze at this time. But there's a lot of this kind of cultural underpinnings that are coming up in our culture more to the mainstream. It used to be very esoteric back in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, but then it was coming more into the mainstream. So while this is coming out, I'm trying to understand this artwork. The culture is shifting, and Andy Warhol also leaves. Pop art is really a completed phenomenon as far as an art form. And I go, it's Omni Art. So I published a little thing in the Village Voice just to say this happened in 1988, in the fall of 1988, and that's how Omni Art was born. So again, the story to me, though, that's most intriguing is the soul piece, which I called Map up until I think it was about 1991. I think it changed over to Soul, because I realized Soul is actually more of a direct description of what it is. Now, the way I found out what this piece meant is really interesting. I was doing a benefit concert in the University of Colorado Planetarium in 1996, in Boulder, or 1997 rather. And the woman who was the manager of that planetarium said to me, you know, you really need to see this after the show was over. It was all very successful, and everybody enjoyed the presentation, and I love the dome with all the star fields. It was very cosmic. But she says, you need to meet this guy who's a visiting professor here. He's the world's foremost authority on black holes. And he's going to be doing a lecture just for the top select graduate students. And he'll be here next week. I went, black holes? Okay, why not? So I went to the show and sat in the back of the theater. And I'm watching this dome, and he's talking about the various constructions, what make black holes, how they operate, how the universe, how they analyze them, how they understand what their function is, and a lot of it's theoretical, but a lot of it's known. It was a pretty technical lecture. But what fascinated me the most was when he projected onto the dome the geometrical formation and shape of a black hole. It was this artwork. And I just went, oh my God, that's my painting. And I thought, so
it was a real confirmation.
It was, well, I still didn't get it. I thought, well, what does that mean? I mean, a black hole? I mean, I made a black hole from a dream, whatever. So, but what I did understand is about these 5 dimensions, they relate to esoteric Hindu and Buddhist teachings that go back to ancient times, and actually before into ancient Sanskrit. And the first time they appeared in the Western world in their descriptive mode was when Madame Blavatsky was doing a lot of her education process and bringing through the Theosophical Society into the Western culture the understanding of these dimensions that the Hindus have had knowledge of for many, many thousands of years. And the 5 dimensions are the dimensions that we operate with as human beings. So the first dimension, which is a vibrational field in quantum physics, which is a coarse, dense field, is called the physical. But then you have the dream state, the astral dimension, which they describe the phenomena, psychic phenomena happens in that, or thought. It's also the field of a lot of the emotional body, the emotional field that human beings experience. They would say that's an astral dimensional field. The next field in finer vibration is the causal field, which is the Akasha Records. And the Akasha Records are the words they use to describe the, it's like the library of the universe, of all cause-effect relationships of all time and space. And then you have the mental dimension, and that's a field of thought. That's where a lot of the heavens of the Orthodox religions occur, in Buddhism and Vedantism and whatnot. And then you have the etheric, which is actually the high part of the mental field. It's like the subconscious according to Western science. And then there's the soul plane, which is singularity. So all the four dimensions below the 5th dimension are all duality dimensions. And that 5th dimension is singularity itself, which is source. So that's all happening. I'm going, okay, I know what that is. I kind of know what that is, but I didn't know what that black hole thing meant until I understood something, and that is when you as a being travel in your consciousness, you act as if as a black hole occurs, which is you collapse matter and move into like a wormhole of energetics into a different dimensional field, and you can travel to other places. So in the dream state, you wake up in a lucid dream, you're in a complete astral field is completely populated by things that seem completely real when you're there. People who have lucid dreams, they know. This is like, I could smell it, I could feel it. They are actually in that dimension as soul operating in that field. So I'm looking at this whole thing going, this is crazy. It's fascinating, but it's amazing if this came through completely. I mean, I never studied this stuff before the piece came through.
Right, your knowledge came afterwards.
Right, so I make the piece and it's been a teacher all these years. Then the most astounding thing happened. Right after this concert, this piece, and you see on the front, is actually called a metaform. And we were producing a convocation in Denver, or expo, called the Whole Life Expo, which is a collection of a lot of people who are working on a lot of esoteric information, and there's scientists who are working with ideas that are quite not arrived yet. They're sort of looking into things, and there's the health food people. It's a consortium of a lot of cultural cutting-edge people. And this guy pulls up in front of the office in a car, and I see him out the window. He's in a white car, and I see him. I say, I think I know who that is. He called earlier and was asking for directions. So I left the house and went out to the car, and he's opening the trunk as I'm getting there, and he pulls out this metaform. And I go, that's a really interesting thing. What is that? And he goes, well, I don't know. I just was told to make this. I make these things, but I was told these dimensions last night in a dream. This is for real. And I go, really? And what's it for? He goes, I don't know. And he just pulls it out. I go, wow, that's really incredible. Now, oddly, I had this art piece hanging up at the office at that place. And I just instinctively walked up to the front of the artwork inside with this form, walked inside, and it fit exactly in the circle. Like right where you can see.
So now it's permanently attached? It's
permanently attached.
Wow.
And what I recognize that piece is a three-dimensional, actually it's a five-dimensional mandala. It has so complex, and I had some sacred geometers look at it and help me understand it, but it actually represents not only the five dimensions, but also represents energetics of induction and I forgot the other word they use, but it's a way of transmitting energy through dimensional fields with geometry. So
it's a conductor.
It's a conductor and an inductor. That's correct. And I'm going, I mean, I put the thing together. This thing shows up. It wasn't white. I did paint it white to fit on there, but it was ready. It was ready. It was ready.
Great.
So I put that on there. Now all this information came over a period, like I said, 16 years, and it's taken me a long time. I didn't write the book Omni Art Language of Consciousness until 2002, and it was published in 2007. So everything's been like this. It's been a slow grow all the way along, and each step has been very considerate and very developed and very worked with. It's not just something I just popped up. And it's completely non-commercial.
Can you give us some information as to what distinguishes Omni Art from the other movements prior to this?
That's a really good question. You know, I was thinking about that a couple days ago, and I think the Omni Art movement, when I look over the last 100 years of human conscious evolution, and I look at cultural evolution, I believe that the Impressionists, the last movement that was really the most profound was the Impressionist movement. Because coming out of the 18th century, the 19th century into the 20th century, we had a complete shift in technology, and the Impressionists were mostly inspired by photography, interesting, because it was a fascinating thing. Before, paintings were made to capture family situations, usually the aristocracy. All of a sudden they had cameras that could take a photograph of a human being or a situation and record that event. And they were fascinated by the fact that light could pass through a film and make an impression on a plate, and that could capture what they see in the physical world. It just exploded the mind. It's hard for us to understand in the age of the internet.
The impact of
but it was a huge change. And the art forms prior to that were completely classical. And they were just to capture the fold of the fabric, the movement on the face, whatever. They to capture the look of the individual or the object. But all of a sudden they started realizing objects, and this is physics in its earlier stages, objects are actually informed and defined by light itself. So light hitting the body, they wanted to capture
the shape.
Right. So they wanted to capture that energy. That's why Van Gogh's paintings are so powerful, because he was in an altered state when he was painting. So he's like painting as fast as he can to capture this light, because it's so fast. And so when they came through with their paintings, they were done rapidly. They were done with pointillism. They were done really quickly, and that
energy is captured on the canvas itself.
Yep. And the Beaux-Arts school, which was the prevailing art school at the time, was very classical in form. So they felt this. They called these people the fauves, or the beasts. So they thought, oh my God, these canvases are horrible. You know, they look like a sketch before you finally finish a painting. But that was a very profound change in art. And from the Impressionist movement exploded abstract expressionism, abstract surrealism, Rothko, Jasper Johns, Pollock, all the emotionally based, charged artists. But it really started right there in Impressionism. And then it went all the way up through to the 1950s, and then the pop art world came in, and it was more about culture. And it was more about the consciousness, the human consciousness of commercialized culture. So, you know, I don't know how the Impressionists did it. I've studied some of it in, you know, my past, and I think it just happens. It's now at this point in my life, I think most things just happen. You know, it's very hard to trace every little thread that makes something happen, and especially from my experience in doing these art pieces, because I had no idea what I was really doing. I was just kind of going with the flow, but they've become real instructive, and it's a big ask to say you're going to do art that's about singularity, or, you know, what the traditional religion is called God or source or whatever you want to call it. But hey, who am I to argue with how these things unfold? You know, our culture has a life of its own.
Yes, it does. So can you talk a little bit about the content of your book, Omni Art, The Language of Consciousness, and how that came about through your movement that you created?
The book was written because the artworks were not known. When I looked at them, I didn't know what they meant until I started writing about them. And I would gaze at one of the pieces, and I'd start writing and go, oh, and here's how they're made. I'd be driving down the road, and I'd see a car fender that was all torn up on this. I'd have to stop and get a little pickup truck, stick the junk in the car, and I'd take it home. And I have all these pieces in the big studio I had in this old ice cream factory on the Hudson. And I have all these pieces lying on the floor, and I would sit there and drink my coffee, and pull things and start putting them together, and then the canvas would come in. I'd pull the canvas and then attach it, and I'd look at this thing and go, it's done. I don't know what that is, but it's finished. And then these pieces, so this is how all 12 pieces arrived from 1981 through 1991. It took 10 years because I didn't have a lot of budgeting, and I didn't have one place to do it. So I did it in a barn, I did it in a studio, I did it in my garage. I did all these pieces in various time frames over a period of time, and then I wrote the book. So Omni Art's a little interesting in this way, and I taught an arts atelier at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art in about 1995 or so. And one thing I learned is this technique is that it's kind of a backwards art. In other words, you go in there and you create first, and then you figure it out. You know, it's very different than theater. Theater is written like, okay, we're going to write a story, here are the characters, and now we're going to make the sets and the costumes, and we're going to write the music to fit the story. Omni Art is, you create all the sets, you create all the costumes, you create all the stuff, and then you figure out what the story is. Completely different. And what I found out is that's actually a spiritual technology, because what it does is it gets the human ego out of the way, and the mind, which loves the addiction to stories, and it gets soul to speak directly from the source.
That's very powerful.
And it was huge with kids, because when I taught the atelier, it was 5th graders through 11th graders, and what they created would have blown your mind. And the parents were like, where did they get this stuff? I said, they got it from their deepest core. They got it from who they are as soul, not
their essence.
Who they are, yes. And it was a very interesting thing. So, you know, the book was written to explain what I understood from having lived with these teachers, these art pieces. And there's still more to it, but I found that as I wrote about it, they're assemblage artworks. So the art objects actually represent different aspects of a consciousness and awareness, and then as they work in contradistinction to each other as well as juxtaposition to each other, they actually weave a storyline that makes sense to the human mind, and it has some usefulness in our physical world.
So for the purposes of this presentation today, could you use that analysis that you've just described to work with this piece?
This piece is pretty simple, actually. Yeah. This one here, the jewel is like an octagon jewel that's in the third eye, which is a traditional, third eye is the, Plato talked about it as the eye of soul. When all things are lost and destroyed, we go back to the eye of soul and it re-illuminates everything that we need to know about life. Very interesting, he's also the one who discovered the 5 Platonic solids way, way, way back when he was writing. And also the Platonic solids were described by Pythagoras, I found out later. So there's a lot of ancient history behind this. It's not it's an ancient art and it's a very futuristic art at the same time. But the third eye, of course, is open there. This piece again was done originally in 1981, and then the hand is kind of like the reaching for the stars or reaching for higher knowledge, reaching for a knowingness that transcends the mental body, the mind. And then this, you can't see the whole piece here, but it's basically a mannequin bursting through fabric, and it's got this piece going off like this is like a wing, so it's kind of like the material world just like blasting right through the physical illusion.
From other dimensions.
Yes, yeah. It's like the awareness coming out of the ancient past into the future. It has a lot of symbolizations in it, but I think the main thing about it is like a new age. So I call this, originally called this painting the Age of Truth, and I just call it Truth, because I believe that as science merges together with its language of quantum physics, merging with the language of art, and merging with the language of culture, we're coming into a common language to describe our human experience. So I see this piece as kind of it's kind of like a mascot for that age.
Okay.
There's a piece on there's an artwork on the Arc de Triomphe in Paris called Liberty Leading the People, which has this female figure kind of like the Statue of Liberty, but you got the flowing fabrics and she's going forth and she's leading the people to liberty, This is kind of leading the human soul to spiritual freedom, awareness of itself, of what it really is all about here.
Now, to give a sense to our listening and viewing audience, could you give a sense of how large these are? What are the proportions of the canvases?
This is a detail shot of a larger piece. It's 4 by 8 feet.
Okay.
So they were done for installation purposes.
And where are they now? The actual canvases?
These pieces, along with all the kabuki costuming and everything, is in storage in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Yeah. This is a detail shot of the center of the soul piece. It's actually a diamond shape. It's a little larger. You don't see it, but there's a crystal pyramid over here. It kind of represents the esoteric journey to higher awareness. And so it kind of swirls around. Fascinatingly enough, this piece also had another piece that came in over my podcast, which I interviewed all these different people, everybody from John Bogle, who is as conservative as you can get. He founded the Vanguard Group, the largest mutual fund company in the world, and one of Wall Street's giants, so very mainstream. Gary Hart, mainstream. All these mainstream, and also people who are way out there, crop circle of knowledge, everything you can imagine. And I always listen to every detail because I basically am an explorer myself. But this piece, the round, is also in these things called the Dropa stones, which are Tibetan. They were found in Tibet. They're 12,000-year-old stones. They're about this big. I believe they're about this big. They have the little circle, and they have the spiral. So it has the spiral of life, and it has that same shape. And the esoteric belief is that the Dropa people, who are these little tiny people with huge heads, they actually crashed their spaceship and couldn't get out of, couldn't leave, and so they carved this technology into the stone. It's been refuted. It's one of those, I'm not sure, but it's truly compelling if you look into the details of it. But it's interesting that shape's in there. And also, that shape is also in, there was a video shot a number of years ago by a UFOologist who had obtained footage from the space shuttle that was taken out of one of the bays. They were doing a tether experiment, where there was this long tether going into space, about 10 miles long. They were experimenting with receiving solar energy and how to capture it, whatnot. But in the footage that was shot in infrared, which is a very high vibrational field ascertainment, you can actually see these discs floating in front of the tether and behind it, and they're translucent and they kind of pulse. It's fascinating stuff. There's that shape again. Has a little. There's that. See that little notch there?
Yep.
The little round piece has a little notch. Again, the 5 different dimensions. We're just beginning to understand this universe. I mean, us humanoids are definitely, we've been through a lot of different histories, but in this particular time frame, we are just scratching the surface. So I think that, it's interesting that shape has shown up in various ways, and I'm not completely sure what everything is.
Yeah. But
there's a lot of information in there. One of the people I had on the podcast is a very well very well credentialed researcher of crop circles. And again, these are showing up all over the world, 5,000 of them, way beyond just some guys with a couple planks making them. They're very complex, sophisticated shapes, and they also have all these geometries in it. So I believe that humanity is being invited into a larger language that's a more universal language with off-worlders who are, if you read anything or watch anything, you'll know that this is not just made up now. There's a phenomenon, there's thousands and thousands of people who are reporting these things all at the same time. So something's going on with the planet Earth.
Yeah.
It's being imprinted with all these various languages we don't completely comprehend. Some people are more focused on it, understand it better. Some don't even know it's happening. So there's various layers of people and awareness, which has always occurred in the human race.
Yes.
But the people who are really interested are looking into this, and these artworks kind of appear the same way. So, although I take responsibility for their creation, I can't take responsibility for what they mean because I don't even know fully at this point, even today.
So you've mentioned a few times or referenced your podcast. How did your podcast come to be? What was the initiation or impetus for that?
I'm a latecomer in a way. I'm between the early baby boomers and the Gen X. So I'm right at the last piece of the baby boom generation. So I wasn't raised with computers. I kind of came into it later. So when a friend of mine in Santa Fe said, this Omni Art thing's really interesting. I'd like to do we should do an interview or a podcast on it. I said, well, it's a podcast. This is 2005. And he said, I'm going to buy the equipment. Just come over. We're just going to interview. And of course, I thought, I can't do that. I got to be prepared. He said, we just went and did it. So he started asking me questions about Omni Art, all my experiences with Warhol and all the things that happened in New York and whatnot. And the first show, I think we had 50 listeners. There were like 4,000 podcasts at that point in time in the world. And by the second month, there were 100,000 people listening. It was just like, boom. And we started inviting people we knew in Santa Fe that were interesting and, pretty culturally astute, evolved people who knew things that the average person wouldn't be speaking about. And we started putting it on there. And the next thing you knew, I started having authors calling me, and it just sort of became something. They handed the whole show over to me. I figured out the Apple system of how to produce them and produced the whole thing myself. And I had, over the years, I've had about 260 people, and it's been amazing who's come to me to just give me their information, and also the variety of people has been astounding.
How have these interviews affected your own art and the expression of Omni Art?
Well, it's kind of like, you do feng shui and you do room design. So, when you put a lot of tension on one part of the room until you get it just right, and then it relates to another part of the room over here, and then there's another part over here, and then the rest of the house. And it's all tied in with the family and their issues and their consciousness and their health.
There are lots of layers.
Lots of layers. So the podcast to me has been the exploration into all those 5 dimensions. So this is kind of like the core piece of the whole thing. And then the podcast has been, kind of going in there and looking at some piece of something, like maybe you'll have a psychotherapist who's put a lot of attention on the romantic self and the female understanding of sex and love or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little piece of the astral body or the mental body tied together. What it does is it's like whoever comes to me, it kind of goes into a filter through these 5 dimensions, and I kind of see how things fit.
Mm.
So it's a new education is what it amounts to. And the podcast has been completely organic.
Mm.
You know, it's just people showing up.
So if you were to be given a carte blanche in terms of how to take what you've created up till this point and take it to the next step, even beyond your wildest dreams, in terms of art and consciousness and science and how it would impact on culture and people's lives, how would you see that manifested in an ideal world?
You know, it's very difficult for me as the facilitator of bringing this information through and the way it's coming through to understand its effect.
Mm-hmm.
All I know is how the vision comes together for me to put this into a form that feels complete and contextually integrated. Mm-hmm. So ideally, I would like to see at least these art pieces in a museum installation with the musical landscape.
And its entirety too, because up until this point, it's not had
full and I've never filmed all the kabuki characters.
Okay.
And I'd like to put that kabuki character musical piece together in a film, and in an installation that would be in a theater or to be in a black box or something.
Or museum.
Yeah, in a museum you could build it out in the theater. So just be kind of a continuous role. Someone could kind of go in and out if they wanted to be in the middle of it or the end, whatever. And then the art pieces would be around and they'd be explained, and it would be kind of a sort of a public sacred space. Because I believe that what this information is telling me is that all of life is God. It has nothing to do with division or separation. It's really, and that's why we've in the past the human beings have built temples and abodes. They say nature's where God is. It's not. I don't think any of that's true. I think the truth is that everything is part of the expression of the divine, because it all comes from singularity and it goes into all these dimensional fields and it gives itself expression. So it couldn't possibly be anything but from one source. It doesn't make any sense. It's just science in my mind. So I'd like to see those pieces all together, just because I think it'd be valuable, and where people take it in their own existence is their business, whether it's a scientist. I mean, when Andrew Hamilton, Dr. Hamilton, came over to look at the art piece, I had him come over because he had this thing. He just, I could see him like, you created this from what? I said, it was a dream about 15 years ago. And he's like looking at me like, huh? I said, yeah, I don't know. What do you think? And I showed it to him and he goes, it makes me think I need to make a model of my design because it's really good to be able to see it physically.
It's true.
So it helped him in some little way. I mean, who knows how, if someone doesn't know what I'm talking about at all and they hear these words, perhaps they'll go, I can understand that. I hear this. This makes sense to something, experience that I've had. So, without getting, I don't feel like I'm here to fix or change anything. I'm just here to be who I am and bring my piece forth. And that's like any artist is that way.
Well, you had mentioned in the beginning of the conversation that you created this atelier where you worked with children and bringing some of these concepts to their level of consciousness. Are there any aspects of that educational component that you could bring in to today's conversation as a way of maybe simplifying some of the terms or distilling it to its essence, that someone who is not exposed to the arts or someone who is just getting started would be able to benefit from this amazing information?
Well, it's a big question because, you know, you're talking about education, and education's a big, fat subject. I feel like one of the things that are holding education back today is the fact that we fragment everything. So we have everybody separated by age, by sex, by role, by you name it. We're a very divisional culture. We put everything in categories. And because Omni Art works backwards, it's sort of it's sort of like the mandala the Tibetans do with their sand. You know, it's like it kind of messes all that up and says, okay, let's start over here. Let's turn it over, and instead of create, let's be the creation, and then let the outside see what we're just creating. So we're coming from source itself within. And when you open up that possibility, you have no idea what's going to come forth. I mean, I had 5th graders in this atelier. It was a summer atelier. It lasted about 3 weeks. Coming up with things that the 11th graders were like, wow, wow, that's so cool. You know, they were like, their minds were exploding with something that came through the process.
Because there were no limitations.
There were no limitations, and there was no definitions on it until it was complete. And then it was a fully expressed art form. I think that's a transformative thing for all of culture, no matter whether you're a businessman trying to figure out a new product line or a new product development for the population. You know, in the 1940s, a lot of people don't know this, but marketing as an idea was created in the 1940s. It used to be that someone would say, I have an idea, I'm going to make something, I'm going to go sell it to the world. But in marketing, they started saying, let's find out what people want and then we'll make that. So it turned it around. So instead of being creator giving forth, it became, okay, creator, we want you to meet our needs. And the needs, a lot of times people don't know what they want. So if you do it all with just taking what they want, you're going to have a lot of limitations. We need people who just are willing to create and put out there because it inspires great breakthrough.
Well, a lot of artists do that, those that are cutting edge and bringing culture to a new level of understanding.
Well, Walt Disney did that. He just had a dream. You know, it was hard for him to do that. He went bankrupt 7 times. But he did get his dream established, and now it's a massive socially informative, you know, institution that changed the world. So who knows? You know, when you unleash the divine in every human being, who knows what could happen? We could all be spacing out with the guys who are traveling off-world, you know. We could figure that out really fast.
Yes. So with the time that we have remaining, I would like to, you have a signature question that you ask on your show to all of your guests. And I'm offering you the opportunity to answer your own question, which is, how do you phrase it? There's a specific way that you phrase it.
Oh, yes. I always ask people, if there's one thing you tell the whole world that they really need to know, but they just don't seem to be getting, what would that one thing be? That we know it all. We have all this knowledge within us. It's a matter of uncovering it, to allow the layers to be pulled back naturally, to recognize who we really are. That's what I've learned from doing this over 30 years.
So what would be some simple techniques for an individual to initiate that process of uncovering the answers that are already within?
Just trust themselves, and when they have a little nudge or a little impetus, to go follow with it and just do it.
Great.
You know, just do what you get to do. And now, of course, if you're having an imbalanced situation when you're really furious, you may not want to do something when you're really angry or whatever. But when you're in a state where you're in a loving state, and you're in a, you know, what the Buddhists would call a meditative state, other religions might call contemplation or prayer or whatever, or some people just just turning off the TV and being quiet. Listen to your inner guidance, because you have access to everything. There's a scientist by the name of Rupert Sheldrake who's in Cambridge, I believe, and he's written a book about the morphic fields, which are these fields of information, what the Hindus call the Akasha. And the brain, you know, being 90% water, is really like an antenna, you know, because there's electrical charge. I mean, it's an electrical field that could be, it can receive information. And he talks about how people just know things, how information comes to you. And that's something that human beings, and I have a feeling a lot of the off-worlders who've made contact with various human beings on this planet have been seeing how far developed we are in that ability. Because in our popular media, we show space exploration like metal ships with jet propulsion. And we do have warp drive. We were talking about Star Trek a little bit earlier. But really, it's so much more sophisticated than that. So, I mean, you can see these things, they pop in and out. It's quite extraordinary. They're using physics. They're not using, Newtonian physics. They're using quantum physics. They're using vibrational field mechanisms. And I think that we're being invited to make the next evolutionary step and really speak the higher language of science, consciousness, and all of it together.
Great. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for joining us today at the O'Hanlon Art Center. And it was fascinating to hear your story. Would also like to thank our listening and audience here today for their support, and wish also to thank the O'Hanlon Center themselves, and also special attention to that annoying fly. We're in a nature setting. We have this fly around us, but anyway, so thank you very much, and wish everyone a great day.
Thank you.
Look forward to another interview soon. Thank you.
I kind of came up with this as a writing. I was talking about Omni Art coming from Bucky Fuller, which is a very interesting thing, but also there's that other side, the divine side of it. So I wrote this little I guess it's a poem describing what I think captures that. And it starts, "Love has no bounds, knows no restrictions, and is not limited by conditions. Like its source, it is omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient. Love is inherent in all of life, and when activated by focus and determination, most certainly will steer the course of one's life experiences to the highest and most sacred expressions possible." And this is Omni Art.
Great.